This episode of Legaleagle was made possible by Skillshare. Learn to think like a lawyer for free for 2 months by clicking the link in the description. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution states that the President shall be Commander-in-Chief, and he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. So under that language, can the President pardon himself? That's what we're going to find out today. Hey Legal Eagles, welcome back to Lawsplainer, where we explain the most important legal concepts of the day. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell for more legal explanations, and don't forget to leave a comment in the form of an objection. Today we're going to figure out whether the President has the power to pardon himself. But first, let's talk about what a pardon is. A pardon is an action bestowed on the President by the Constitution of the United States that completely sets aside or commutes the punishment for a crime. A pardon is an admission of guilt. To accept the pardon, the recipient must essentially admit that he committed the underlying crime. Now, a pardon only applies to, quote, offenses against the United States. In other words, federal crimes. The President has no authority to pardon state crimes. One of the reasons that this is particularly important now is that President Trump in a news conference recently stated, "I have an absolute right to pardon myself."
No, I'm not above the law. I never want anybody to be above the law. But the pardons are a very positive thing for a president. I think you see the way I'm using them. And yes, I do have an absolute right to pardon myself, but I'll never have to do it because I didn't do anything wrong.
He also tweeted, "As has been stated by numerous legal scholars, I have the absolute right to pardon myself. But why would I do that when I've done nothing wrong? In the meantime, the never-ending witch hunt led by 13 very angry and conflicted Democrats and others continues into the midterms." So the question is, does the President actually have the power to pardon himself? Well, as with most things in constitutional law, we should start with the text of the Constitution. Here, the text of the Constitution provides a clear limit on the President's pardon power. The Pardon Clause provides that the President cannot pardon anyone in cases of impeachment. Now, there is an open question as to whether a sitting president can be indicted or whether the only remedy when a president has committed some sort of wrongdoing is impeachment. In fact, I did a whole video on that. There will be a link to that down in the description. If impeachment, however, is the only remedy when the president has committed a crime, then it would make sense that the impeachment exception to the pardon power would prevent the president from pardoning himself. And if the president cannot pardon himself because that necessarily implicates an impeachment inquiry, this principle could extend to individuals whose actions may be relevant to that same impeachment inquiry. For example, Paul Manafort or Mike Flynn or other members of President Trump's campaign and staff have credible allegations against them that may implicate the president, and therefore by necessity that may implicate impeachment, which would prevent the president from issuing any kind of pardon as it regards himself or as it regards the other members of his cabinet. But the impeachment exception to the president's pardon power has never been tested, so it's an open question whether that actually provides a limit against the president pardoning himself or not. But on top of that, there is also a general principle in US law that a person cannot be the judge in their own case. In fact, in 1974, when President Nixon asked the Office of Legal Counsel, the OLC, to determine if he could pardon himself, the OLC relied on that principle in saying that President Nixon could not pardon himself. In the famous August 5th, 1974 memo, Mary Lawton, the acting Assistant Attorney General, wrote, quote, "Under the fundamental rule that no one may be the judge in his own case, the president cannot pardon himself." 4 days later, Nixon resigned in disgrace. So given that President Nixon's staff opined that he could not pardon himself, and that even President Nixon would not go so far as to issue a self-pardon, that is potentially persuasive authority that the president doesn't have the power to self-pardon. Now, there's really only one Supreme Court case that's on point in this particular case, and that is the Ex parte Garland case from 1866. This is a Supreme Court case that often gets used as an example of how the president's ability to pardon is basically unfettered, but I think there's actually a different principle that is more important here. The Ex parte Garland case concerned Congress's ability to exclude members of the Confederacy from practicing federal law after the Civil War, and whether the president could pardon a Confederate senator. The Supreme Court held 5-4 that the president could in fact pardon the Confederate senator, but more importantly, the court held unanimously that the Supreme Court has the authority to interpret the scope of the pardon power. Like the bedrock Supreme Court case of Marbury versus Madison, Ex parte Garland is probably less important for the actual outcome of the case than the principle that the Supreme Court has the overview authority to interpret the Constitution in this case and make a decision one way or another. In other words, it's less important as to whether the president has the pardon power in question than the fact that the Supreme Court has the ability to review the president's pardons in the first place. So if I was going to try to predict what would happen if a president ever tried to pardon himself, the way things stand, it appears that there's nothing that would stop the president from pardoning himself in the first instance. But under current Supreme Court case law, the Supreme Court has the power to review that pardon. And if I had to guess what the Supreme Court would do with a self-pardon, I would think that the Supreme Court would actually nullify the president's self-pardon on the grounds that either the president cannot be the judge in his own case, or that the impeachment exception applies, which prevents the president's pardon from going into effect. Now, regardless of whether the president actually has the power to self-pardon, it is almost universally acknowledged that if a president ever did try to pardon him or herself, that it would almost certainly lead to impeachment by the House and Senate and removal from office. But that is not necessarily required by the Constitution. But frankly, I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that I hope we never have to actually test that legal principle in action. Just to be on the safe side, members of the current administration might want to brush up on their job skills, just in case. Like, for example, learning a new language, like Russian. I'd recommend Alina Sychova's Skillshare course on basic Russian. I hear there are many job opportunities for senior campaign officials in Russia, and it always helps to learn the language of your employer. Skillshare is an online learning community that has over 20,000 classes on everything, like lifestyle, design, and technology. The first 500 Legal Eagles will get 2 free months of Skillshare when you click on the link below. The free premium membership gives you unlimited access to must-know topics so you can improve your skills and learn new things. Например, как выучить русский язык. So click on the link, get 2 free months, and start learning today. And until next time, I'll see you in court.